Pecha Kucha 118, Luthor, Constantine, and Miller. That would be Frank Miller. I've been reading the comics and I've read some real crackers. Everything in here is like a big deal for one reason or another. And they're all legacy pieces, right? So Hellblazer, Original Sins, takes one of my favorite comic book protagonists, and I think it's his original comic book run from the 80s. He's a magician, British-based. He's an asshole. But at the end of the day, he does save the world. I just took a chance on this and bought it at a comic book store. I was worried when I saw the art, which is definitely of the 80s with these very flat colors and stuff. But the artwork is pretty strong, despite the simplicity of the coloring. It shows its age. And Constantine is so well written. Like the very first thing Constantine says after paying for his... Oh, no. Is the first thing he says is bloody airline food, bloody rain, bloody England, right? He's a bit of a sourpuss. He's a cheeky bastard. He always gets the last laugh, but usually there's a price to be paid. His list of friends gets smaller and smaller as every issue goes on because he's literally visited by the ghosts of people he's betrayed to save the world, and he jumps out a train to avoid them in this one and ends up in a full body cast. Fun times. But yeah, Constantine, I think it's great. I've never read a bad one. Luthor by Brian Azzarello and Lee Bermeo. Phenomenal. It's Superman from the perspective of the bad guy. This is one of the best comic book trade paperback collections I've ever read. I don't want to overstate how good it is, but making Superman the bad guy just by pictures like this, where his eyes are glowing and he's hovering above the eye line of Luthor. Who exactly is the good guy here? And, Lee Bermeo's artwork is phenomenal. But the writing of Brian Azzarello is equally high level. Like, this entire scene is about Lex Luthor apparently losing a remote control, but it subtly kind of parodies the entire narrative, the entire plot. And if you realize what Lex Luthor's doing in this scene, you'll realize what he's doing across the entire comic. And it's brilliant. Far too clever for comics. Another standout moment is the character Mr. Orr, who's the guy with the moustache here. He's Lex Luthor's right-hand man, and he does lots of shady stuff. And he's interesting because he's just a guy that gets stuff done, and he's a bad man, and bad men make for interesting characters. Helps he's Texan, of course. Bruce Wayne meets Lex Luthor, or I should say the other way around. Lex goes to Gotham. And the relationship between these two is very interesting. There's not a lot here, but there's a very large ambiguity to whether Luthor knows Wayne is Batman, and it's very interesting. And then Batman and Superman have a fight because, well, I mean, why wouldn't they? And this is just, Lee Bermejo's composition and the way that Superman is portrayed as kind of this alien aggressor throughout this entire thing. It's a very interesting take on the whole Superman mythos, and I recommend it to you whether you give a shit about Superman or not. Because I don't, but I keep reading things like this. Right, so Frank Miller, The Dark Knight Returns. This is one of the best Batman comic book trade paperbacks ever, written in the 80s, 1986, I think. This redefined Batman for a generation. It starts with Batman retired, so it's a dystopian future kind of thing. He's drinking with Gordon. Just the paneling, the composition, the art, the story, everything here is A1. It's A1. I highly recommend. Batman does come out of retirement, and he's dealing with a new breed of criminals who are just kids that break the law not for profit but for pleasure. They're real degenerates. It is a dystopian future, and here's one of those little subtle hints why. Miller's depiction of Superman is a little bit antagonistic too. He's shown saving the world in the shadows because of something that happened in the past. Not the same reason Batman retired, but not so different. The there's a lot going on. Miller's visual flair, his writing. This is the reason Frank Miller basically got to write the second book, The Dark Knight Strikes Again, which is unfortunately pretty much the polar opposite. Written maybe a decade later or more, Miller at this point quite evidently does not give a fuck. Let's discuss, right? There's a notable decline in the quality of the artwork, and you can argue it's simpler, it's stronger, it's more confident, but I'd argue that's true, but it's lazy, it's poorly paced, characters are ill-defined. Lynn Varley as the colorist has to do an impossible job of like being in the fill-in artist. I mean, like Frank Miller just doesn't draw backgrounds. The synopsis is that Lex Luthor and Brainiac have conquered the world, and Batman has to lead a ragtag resistance to something blah blah. It's there's this kind of political undertone to this about big government being the bad guy, and you know, pages like this, one can't help but wonder if Miller's being overtly insane and satirical and just trying to take DC's money and run. I mean, God only knows what's going on. I'd recommend reading this just to see how bad it is, because you won't believe it, especially if you read the first one before The Dark Knight Returns, and then you read The Dark Knight Strikes Again. What do they say about like water and oil? They don't mix. Right, so it's the end of the year. Yeah, read everything I suggested. You can probably find most of them in your local library, and you can certainly find PDFs online if you're inclined, and you should be. This is good shit. So it's the end of the year. I'm going to try and do stuff that's productive next year. So I'm going to spend the next week and even this evening trying to figure this shit out. The Pecha Kucha may change, it may not. It's the only thing I do that's like quantifiable output, and it's the backbone of whatever goes forward. But it's not real YouTube content, so I should make some real YouTube content, but I can't let that define how I spend all my time, because video editing is a motherfucker. It just takes forever. And I need to spend that time drawing and getting better at drawing and reading comics that have been drawn by people who draw better, etc., etc. I also need to spend dedicated time in Adobe software so that all the things on my CV maintain a certain air of truth. This logo designing stuff I'm doing may go somewhere if I can get my Adobe skills up to a point where I can put a nice portfolio together and either generate money freelancing or get this guy who's giving me bits and pieces to give me an actual job. So that's something that I have to take seriously, because it beats working for a living, trust me. And I do think I need to, irregardless of what I do with it, spend time drawing on paper. I've been doing a little bit of sketching this week, and I got my Pentel brush pen out. That took me a while to find, and it's cathartic, even if it's not necessarily good stuff I end up with showing. It's not as bad as Frank Miller's worst. But Frank Miller at his worst is as bad as Frank Miller is at his best when he's good. So that's yeah, I should be so lucky to be either. It brings us to the end of Pecha Kucha 118, and I will see you next time.